Welcome to Church 3.0, presented by Apollos, a podcast where we explore the nuances of modern Christian culture and the challenges of cultivating community while maintaining impact and relevance in the church. Join Tyler Vance, COO of Apollos, as he talks to church leaders from around the world to gain a deeper understanding of the Christian faith in a modern context. Push boundaries, change lives, create a more hopeful future.
Hey, thank you for joining us today. I've got an incredible guest, Daniel. Daniel, why don't you, first off, as we get rolling, talk about kind of what your day-to-day looks like. You've got an incredible bio of impact in the local church and through the local church. But what does that translate to day-to-day for you?
Yeah. Hey, thanks again for having me on, Tyler. I really appreciate your work and the work of Apollos. Man, my day-to-day looks different every day. But I think that what keeps me focused is at the end of the day, what our work with World Relief does is we're trying to make sure that the church stays on mission when it comes to helping the world's most vulnerable. So I lead a team, a national team through Churches of Welcome, where we come alongside churches to help them think through discipleship resources for how do we actually create spaces of welcoming and belonging for everyone, but in particular vulnerable immigrants and refugees that have come into their city. And so largely what I do is I'm working with church leaders, pastors, mission pastors, helping them to
Yeah.
see the value of this and then helping them to see that this is an issue that isn't going to be solved anytime soon when we're talking about global mass displacement. And then also helping them to understand that, like, at the end of the day, your members who are a part of, the mission of the church, that they have a very tangible and practical way to make a difference in the name of Jesus in the lives of vulnerable immigrants and refugees. So I lead a team. We get to do that, and we get to do that in a crazy time, Tyler. This is a crazy time for this kind of work.
Absolutely. You were sharing kind of in other conversations with me a really cool story close to where I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Yeah.
that had some crazy success. Could you share that story? I just think people
Yeah.
need to hear the tangibles behind what you just said.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Before 2021, very few Americans would have ever had any contact with Afghans.
Mm,
And there is an Afghan population in the United States prior to that. But we all remembered back to 2021 when Kabul fell, and America ended its longest war in history, over 20 years of engagement in Afghanistan. That meant that Afghans, especially those who had sided with the Americans and they were American allies, they had to leave country.
yeah.
And so churches began working to resettle Afghans in the United States. And in Tulsa, Oklahoma, prior to 2021, there were zero Afghan churches. And today there are Afghan house churches in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so this is a part of the dynamic. Like no denominational leader before I came to World Relief, I worked primarily with church planting networks and denominational leaders. No denominational leader could have strategized like the fall of Kabul and how to plant churches in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And although God doesn't author evil and crisis and catastrophe, he will use it for his
Mm,
purposes. And that's a story of how really something that was tragic like that. Now we have Afghan believers in Tulsa, and God did that.
yeah. No, I love it. And you said there are two active house churches
Mhm.
right now
Yep.
in the midst of that.
Yep. And then all around, yeah, I mean, that's Tulsa, right? Because that's your neck of the woods, but all around the United States now.
Sure.
And this is, not, although this is cool and great, this is not uncommon. It's also been the history of persecuted peoples coming to the United States. I mean, you think back to the Puritans. That's the reason why the Puritans came here. You think to the Irish, it's the reason why the Irish have come here. And so, to a large degree, persecuted people and those who are politically oppressed have always found refuge here in the United States, and not just found refuge, but they found the kingdom of God.
Yeah. So describe how Relief, I mean, obviously those house churches came out of an established local church.
hmm
They were birthed kind of out of that. How does World Relief come alongside a local church like that? Maybe in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that's looking around and going, "Hey, my neighbors maybe look different, than they
Sure.
have before. And so how do you equip them?
Yeah. So largely the work that we've done for 45 years, Tyler, is we have been a partner with the local church to resettle refugees into local communities and to show and share the love of Jesus through hospitality, through really basic things like teaching people English, how to get a job, how to navigate transportation, enroll your kids in school. World Relief would oftentimes, in conjunction with our staff and a local church partner, help refugees and vulnerable immigrants restart their lives, and through that build relationships and friendships. And so, and we often say, you hear people say, we don't serve to convert, but we serve because we're converted, and that's not really a
Hmm.
mantra with World Relief, but it is true that the work that we do with churches, at the end of the day, it is evangelistic and it is missional, uh, because it is Christians opening their lives in their houses of worship to refugees and immigrants. And over time, eventually, what happens is people aren't just looking for a physical and a financial restart. They're also looking for a spiritual restart, and they're looking for meaning and purpose for why did we get pushed out, and uh, why why have we ended up where we're at today.
Yeah.
And there's also those who have come to the United States that are already Jesus followers. Matter of fact, a quarter of refugees that come to the United States are already followers of Jesus. A lot of Congolese that have come in the recent years. One of the greatest crises in the world right now is in the DRC. Very
Hmm.
complex issue. And very many of those who have had to leave are Christians. And so we have many Congolese churches that have been started in the last 10 years because they've come here. And here's the fun part. And many of them now are starting to see themselves as not just refugees making a new life. They begin to realize that we have a missional purpose to be here in the United States to also be a part of the mission force. And so that's
Yeah.
happening all across the United States with all different groups of people.
Well, and you bring up a really good point, Daniel. I grew up in my home church as a child. Uh, we were in a community that had a ton of Cambodian refugees.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that probably speaks to my age a little bit for the things that were happening in the world at the time. And I remember even at that point in time, my local church wrapping arms around and with this Cambodian community, and it was an incredible experience for me as a young believer to do that. But I say that because this is a I'm going to use a big word, missiological kind of impact to the world, and in our climate and culture, it's gotten confused with the political.
Hmm.
And I just want to like reframe like the local church, especially in North America, has been doing this for a very long time,
Yeah.
and doing it hopefully better than yesterday, but still leaning in for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love how you phrase that. This is a missiological issue. Sure, there are political policies involved, and the church will always have to navigate, the laws of the land. And although we don't have to be partisan in the issue, we can be, politically intelligent about these issues. But yeah, you're right. If you go back again, I mentioned we don't have to go as far back as the Puritans, but if you go back further, you think about the German church that was established here, the
Mm,
Scandinavian church, which eventually became denominations like the EV Free and the Evangelical Covenant, which, churches that you've served in the past are part of some of these denominations.
mhm.
These were immigrant churches that came here because they wanted religious freedom that they couldn't have in the countries that they came from, and so they began establishing themselves here, not just as Americans but as Christians, and God has used them. So it's always been a part of the tradition of the American church to see immigrant communities establish themselves. And when Cambodians, like your neighbors in the past, and my parents would have come during that period as well in
Mhm.
1979. Some were Catholics, some were Buddhists. My parents were animists, shamanists, and we were sponsored by a little Lutheran church. And
Hmm.
my dad was about 41, 42 when he heard the gospel for the first time in his life. He became the first believer in the history of my family. Yeah, I often say he's the person with my first person with my DNA to follow Jesus.
Hmm.
And it's because of this little Lutheran church in the cornfields that just saw a vision, not just for helping a family restart their lives, but also be introduced to Jesus. And from that, all of my siblings, there's 5 of us, we've all been involved in church planting, international
Hmm.
missions. It's been really, and I say that not, I say that not every refugee will have that experience, and not every
Sure.
vulnerable immigrant will have that experience. But I say that in that there was nobody that would have been able to plan like that trajectory for our family.
Hmm.
But it was all these series of obedience. Again, to me, in my mind, like discipleship is hear God, trust God, obey God. And there's all these series of moments where people heard God and they heard Jesus's voice and they trusted it and they obeyed it. And it's a part of,
Hmm.
completing this like great commission that had really come through some very, what we often call it was the Great Commission that traveled the Refugee Highway. And God's been doing that for a long, long time. And if we're not careful, like our current cultural climate, um, every generation experienced some version of that. And
Hmm.
every time the church kind of cut through sort of the rhetoric and it found its missional or prophetic voice and it moved forward and the church continued to grow because of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, s- I would say, and obviously, I spend my day to day at Apollos. We're built on the foundation of daily habits. We believe in the daily habits of scripture, reading, prayer, and gratitude as exercises. Another way we say that is spiritual fitness to grow your heart closer to God. Discipleship is the core of what we do as believers. It's part of the Great Commission. We might forget that a little bit in the context of the church in North America, but it is through discipleship our eyes are opened, our posture is more aligned to the heartbeat, the footsteps, the passion of what Jesus brings into the table. Love God, love others, two greatest commandments at all. But how do we go about as leaders in the church to equip the person just showing up on a Sunday to have that heartbeat? World Vision, you guys do this. You have a couple of courses
Mhm.
that you guys offer,
Yeah.
as well as some programs that are a little more formal. Could you talk about how you guys do that in the context of discipleship within the local church, even teaching church leaders how to bring kind of awareness to this?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, discipleship is a daily process where you renew your commitments to the Lord and to the church and to His mission. And we've developed over the last few years resources for church leaders to begin having those conversations at the leadership level and then also at the church membership level. And we developed a discipleship resource called Welcome the Stranger, which is really, it takes you through different parts of the scripture to remind you that God's heart has always beat for the widow, the poor, the orphan, the foreigner. This kind of four groups of four people you see just
Mhm.
always throughout Scripture, and even in Matthew 25. One of Jesus's last teaching moments. Both he was rebuking the Pharisees, but also teaching his disciples. As he ends on these four groups, and he actually says that when you welcome these, it's like as if you're welcoming me.
Ooh, ooh.
And so helping a church leader have sort of a daily reality that, your church may not be located in a poor neighborhood, but that doesn't mean that you can't be praying for those around you. That doesn't mean that you couldn't engage practically in those that are lacking resources. So a lot of our resources helps church leaders think through the proximity gap. And so how do I
Mm.
close the proximity gap between me and, my vulnerable neighbor and my church member and their vulnerable neighbors? And we've also developed another discipleship resource called No Longer Strangers, which is really a very practical guide to helping Christians think through, how do I host people?
Mm.
How can I be hosted by people from a different culture? Um, how do I have spiritual conversations in evangelism that's trauma informed, where in a way where I
Mm.
can understand somebody's story without having to force them to rehearse their trauma? And so
Yeah.
these are really, in some ways, for those who are very intuitive, these are things that some intuitive people already know how to do. But for most of us who, again, are learning how to navigate these very complex issues and the issues that people have experienced, it's like hand-holding resources so that they can actually step into a relationship and help in a way that doesn't hurt that relationship.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I love how you describe the simplicity of that. But I mean, how often as believers do we need the simplest thing, the
Hmm.
reminder, the cadence of that? Yes, it might be intuitive, but and how bad is it when you get even 1 degree wrong on that? We want to be intentional. We want to be masterful at how we love and care for our neighbors. And why would we not lean in if there's an opportunity, a resource that you guys offer to be able to do that, right? Um, I just think there's so much there.
And some of it is, I do think that I'll come back to the proximity gap. For most Christians, I think they really do want to make a difference. They really do want to reach their neighbors. They really do care for those who lack resources and are on the margins. But they don't know if this is a trusted resource over here, or they don't
Mm,
want to potentially be branded on either one of the political spectrums, and they just want to know that they're being simply obedient to the great commission and the call of Jesus on their lives. And so all of that stuff is really important, and a part of the reason why we develop these resources is because we do want your everyday Christian to feel confident that, like, I'm not this is not just it's not just a partisan thing that I'm doing, or this isn't just a virtual signal, because I do think that
mm,
some people come into this because they feel shamed, and they feel like if they don't do something, then they're not living up to their and I think
mm.
we also have to be careful that I don't think this is a place where we need to unhealthily shame people. So you're helping people
Yeah.
sort of come into the conversation where they're at, so that they can make a meaningful next step. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, let me click in. It's not just how do I help people, right? It's how do I become more like Jesus,
Mhm. Mhm.
simply. And,
Mhm.
and as long as we continue to help people become more like Jesus,
Yeah.
we win.
Yeah.
And we do that, like I said, we're trying to leverage technology to aid and help that process. You're giving proximity to needs of the community around you and needs of the world, in fairness. And we're just leaning in. This is how we help lead the local church, right? Um,
Yeah. Absolutely.
One
Absolutely.
of the things that you kind of clicked into, and I love to get into more stories. And you were actually even familiar with the story of one of our actual engineers that saw a need locally in Cincinnati, and a people group that had migrated to Cincinnati. Of all places that they migrated, I have no clue why Cincinnati would be on the list. But he stepped in with a need for bicycles and taught them a skill and gave them jobs, and created a bicycle factory out of just this proximity thing. And he was willing to have eyes to see those around him, and how those around him were changing. In fairness, right? Neighbors look different, and noticing that, and leaning into that. But uh, uh, so I'd love to hear more stories. But I want to click into this. You are talking about, and you talked about the kind of the history of what the local church has been in North America, and how immigration and immigrant communities have shaped what that is.
Mhm.
How are we doing that to build the future church?
Yeah, Tyler, to some people, this is a very exciting conversation. To others, it can feel like a very scary conversation. There's a
Mm.
sociologist, his name is Stephen Warner, out of the University of Illinois, Chicago. And he said this about maybe 15 years ago. He said that immigration uh, does not lead to the de-Christianization of America, but the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. And let me explain that.
Mm.
What he is not saying is like the great replacement theory, which is sort of like, here's a group of people that are being replaced by another group of people that's coming in. I think what he's saying is that as we study global migration and especially forced migration, usually forced migration is defined by those who have to leave; they can't return home because of persecution, political or religious, or some sort of climate catastrophe. Um, and the idea is that our church, our model of American church, has in some ways been sort of like the church in Jerusalem for
Mm.
maybe the last 100 years or so. If you go back to the late 1800s, and certainly by the time you get to 1950, the church in America, we have sort of this idea of like the American church. It's codified into who we are as Americans. Part of the reason why in the 1950s we began putting phrases like "in God we trust" on things, "in one nation under God," like all that stuff was added during that time. And so, think about like the Jerusalem church. It was very ethnic centric. It was very kind of nationalistic as well, even though the Jerusalem church eventually was, being oppressed by the Roman government. But then eventually, like the church that becomes a missional church is not the church in Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, if you remember, like church in Jerusalem, kind of after the Great Commission was given to them, they actually said, "Ready, set, huddle," right? Instead of "ready, set, go," it went "ready, set, huddle." And it was through persecution and it was through displacement that the church in Jerusalem began to scatter. And
Mm.
the church that really became the global mission sending agency was the church in Antioch.
Mhm.
And the church in Antioch was filled with, Hellenistic Jews, but also cultural Jews, but also Africans and Cyrenes and all these people. And all of a sudden, like those who were in Antioch, they would look at this group that was gathering, and there was no social label for that group because you
Mm.
couldn't call them Jews, you couldn't call them Cyrenes, you couldn't call them Africans. So they had to come up with a new name. And it was there in Antioch that they were called Christians for the first time. And what Stephen Warner is saying is that we're in a place right now where the American church went from being primarily a Jerusalem church to we're now becoming an Antioch church.
Mm.
And it is, sometimes we use labels like multi ethnic, and even that label is trying to get at like a greater reality.
Yeah.
And as you study the history of immigrants in the United States, there are entire denominations that if it wasn't for new immigrants, the denominations would be facing steep decline. This would be true about some of the largest ones: Assemblies of God, Southern Baptists, name other denominations. And so this is a part of what God is doing to not just reach the nations, but it's in some ways, it's a part of what God is doing to use the global church to disciple the
Mm.
American church. And we're becoming more global Christians. Yeah, I want to be careful how to say that. We're not globalists, but we're becoming more globally minded
Sure.
Christians because the church from around the world now is here in America.
On earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah, there. I don't. Are you a Tim Keller fan by any chance?
I am.
He
I
used
am.
to talk a lot about Leslie Newbegin, and he was talking about. And I don't know if you ever read Leslie Newbegin much at all, but Newbegin was a thinker, missiologist, theologian that really helped like the Western world, in particular Western Europe and the United States, begin thinking about like we actually are a mission field. And these
Yeah.
would have been conversations in the 80s and early 90s. And he did a series. Keller was talking about Leslie Newbegin doing a series of lectures in America, starting in Yale, I believe, in 1984, 85. And Newbegin was asking the time. He was saying, "Can the West be reached? Can the West be reached? Meaning, can the West become Christian again, or whatever?" Right. And so that whole project that was launched during that time was really about this idea: how does the West reach the West?
Yeah.
And if we fast forward to 2020, 2025, it's less about the West reaching the West. It's actually about the world coming to the West.
Mm,
Some of the largest churches in Western Europe today are led by Nigerians. You know, the only denomination that's grown year after year after year for the last 30 years, the Assemblies of God, they've grown predominantly because of the immigrant population. And so, in some ways, we were to ask the question, can the West be reached? Which was Leslie Newbegin's question. We would have to say, if it is, partly because of the global church that's come to the West.
yeah. That's a um it's a very challenging concept to a lot of
Hmm.
pastors in North America, but we've been recipients of missionaries for many years, and probably unknown to a lot of day to day Christians. And so, yeah,
Yeah, and for some of our communities, those missionaries currently look like a fledgling immigrant church down the street.
yeah,
And their motto of revitalizing the United States with vibrant Christianity is probably going to be a little bit different than like 19th, 18th, 19th century American revivalism. Like think about, I want to come back to words of Jesus. Think about Matthew 25, right? And Jesus tells us, when you go to the prison, you visit the prisoner, when you feed the poor. And he says, when you welcome the stranger, it's as if you're
hmm
welcoming me. And there's something that's deeply profound there. Jesus is saying that when you actually embrace those that at times you were most scared to embrace from around the world, um, that you're actually bringing me into your community. And so I think there's a lot of that that's happening right now. The world's missionaries have come to the United States and looks vastly different than the missionaries that we've sent around the world.
yeah, yeah. I do think there's a movement in the local church, and we're certainly seeing it of people that are hungry for discipleship, hungry
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
a deeper, a little more. I don't know what word I would. Almost like an edgier, like a more gritty faith. Maybe
Hmm.
is the way to say that. Like a something that cost me something. Um, and so we see that heartbeat kind of emerging and in our day to day, and we obviously have data to show, hey, these are the interactions that are driving that, right? A lot more prayer in the local church than what we've seen in a long time. I mean, a massive amounts of prayer for each other, for one another, for their communities, and even prayers that mention, hey, sickness, healing. Those are uh, not going away, but the prayers for others are escalating.
Mm.
Um, and so I do think the church is reshaping or positioning towards how do we care for our neighbor,
Yeah.
how to neighbor well. And I know you're connected with some efforts there, even in my home church that I'm a part of, and World Relief is connected to helping my local church, my home church, neighbor and be good neighbors to those around us. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing there, but I don't think it's a one-off stripe. I think this is something that the local church is leaning into in a big way, and continues to gain momentum.
Yeah,
Um,
you've said that well, and Tyler, I just want to add, when you think about like the Great Commission, like um, there's probably an era where we primarily thought about the Great Commission, making disciples of all nations, as like a local church sending the brave and the few across the
sure.
world, and we need more of that. Like not for one second do I want to diminish that. I think we need to do more of that, and we need to do it at greater volume and greater quality. And then probably, in the 70s and 80s, and this is largely driven by kind of the youth volunteer movement, we started doing like a lot of short-term missions. And so it was a local church being able to do short-term missions. And I feel like we're now beginning to also see that, like, these are multiple streams of the same thing of making disciples of all nations. Is that when sometimes our neighbors are the nations that we're called to disciple. We're
Mm,
not going to forsake, the ends of the earth, but we're
yeah.
also not going to forsake the fact that our Jerusalem, our Samaria, that we will also be, called to make disciples among them. And then here's the other thing. There's sort of the flip side of that, that our neighbors who also know Jesus being in our life is also a part of them making disciples of us, which is kind of we often think about discipleship as in like getting that older Paul in my life and him taking me out to coffee. And there's a version in which, like, the Haitian or the Congolese Christian across the street from you being in your life, they are discipling you as well. And we want to close those gaps so that those things
Yeah.
can happen.
Well, and to your point, I mean, my neighbors, uh, even in the last 10 years, are vastly different in nature, right?
Hmm.
Because in the community in which I live, we have low cost of living, we have high job opportunities, and so I think what used to be, regional migrations, even in North America, we're seeing massive migrations of,
Mm.
even within the context of North America, people groups
Hmm.
moving very quickly, right? Um, and so my neighbors look vastly different today than they did 10 years ago, and it's been a beautiful ecosystem. My wife and we consider ourselves front porch people.
Mm.
And so we have great relationships with our neighbors, and they come from various countries and various states now. And there is this community that shapes, and I do believe community is the core of the local church, right? Community
Yeah,
is
that's
that.
right.
And yes, we have a very typical small group, and we attend church service on Sunday mornings. We're 8:30 in the morning. We're early people. Um, but we also have this community of people that have some lawn chairs that sit on our
Mm.
driveway is often
Yeah,
full
love that.
of diversity, right? And so it's all of these expressions that we need to be leaning into as a local church to just sharpen each other, to
Yeah,
learn, to be discipled by one another
yeah.
as well. My kids and I are finishing up a very deep dive into the Apostles' Creed, right? And so, as we're finishing that up, obviously, that last little statement, the communion of the saints. And so, how do we teach our kids in a very active way what that means and how to live that
Hmm.
out?
Yeah,
Um, and for us, it's lawn chairs on a driveway,
yeah.
um,
Love that.
and people from all over walking up, and we just happen to have the basketball goal and the soccer balls and, all the
Man,
things.
if you lived in a cul-de-sac, that is like, that's like the pinnacle of like being the house on the block where everybody comes to.
That's what we want to be.
Yeah,
I don't think
yeah,
our front door gets locked.
yeah, yeah,
And that
yeah.
has emerged. And in a practical way, like my son's small group leader lives in our neighborhood.
Yeah,
And so we've got investment into our kids. This multi-generational thing is happening in the context of that. But
yeah. I love
to your
that.
point, it takes
Yeah,
the discipleship of me and my family to have intentionality to build proximity with people.
yeah.
And then it takes us being open to the discipleship that proximity then brings us. So that makes
Our
it sound like it's very us centric, and it's not at all.
No, well,
So
I
I do
mean,
apologize for that.
our paradigm. I mean, you illustrate well the paradigm that we've been coming around churches to develop is because we do help churches develop what's called a good neighbor team. And
Mm,
so that's the language that we use, a good neighbor team. And it's strategic because we use the word neighbor
hmm
because Jesus' command to love our neighbors, and then to be a good neighbor. And then the idea of goodness. Obviously that's the idea of the gospel. That's the idea of good news.
mm,
And these are the most basic units that when when a church that we work with becomes a church of welcome, we help them understand that like it is probably about like how does your church at large come around, people in your community, but at the end of the day, that's going to translate down to smaller units of what we call good neighbor teams that are agile and they're flexible and they're probably less programmatic and much
Mm,
more relationally oriented. And I think in some ways it's not dissimilar to Acts 2:42
mm,
in the church that was gathered together in homes, and they would be much more agile. And I really do think that in a lot of cases, that is indeed how God has transformed the lives of people. Is through a small group of people that just kept showing up, and they were just
mm.
consistent, and they were always present. And that consistency is what led to a lot of people to change their lives. So yeah, I
Yeah,
love that you guys do that.
absolutely. And I thank you for what World Relief is leaning into and doing. Once again, in my local church, but also in local churches all over. I do want to highlight real quick for $250 a year, you get access to all of your content. You get a year of consulting. You get to begin the journey with World Relief, teaching your people how to have eyes for closer proximity with people, but also giving them the tangible tools to help make those connections meaningful, gospel oriented, and missiological. So thank you guys for doing that. Daniel, is there anything I missed in that?
No, I think you said that beautifully, and I just want to encourage your listeners. I think at the end of the day, and I love what you all do through technology, and I know it's not just about technology, but at the end of the day, we're all doing what Jesus does. We wake up in the morning, we're saying, Father, what do you want me to do? How
Mm,
do I trust you, and how do I obey you in it? And I really believe that that is how you win your neighbor. That's how you win the nations, and that's really what we've all been called to. And that's really that basic idea that's what it is to be a believer: is we hear, trust, and obey.
yeah, absolutely. And our day to day at Apollos is giving you a tool set to help encourage that activity, that behavior, that discipleship within the church that God has called you to steward as a pastor. So we're really well aligned with what World Relief does. And as Christians, what we continue to lean into every day as we pursue Jesus. So thank you, Daniel, for your time. I appreciate it. Hope you guys have enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.